On today's Focus, we're presenting a little-known story of the Vietnam War. During the last stage of the conflict, U.S. officials sent 2 scientists on a secret mission to the country.
Their job was to remove fuel from a nuclear reactor and bring it back to the U.S. before the North Vietnamese could get to it. The scientists were short on time, and failure could have forced them to follow an order, one that could have destroyed many Vietnamese lives. We spoke with one of the scientists and reviewed the operation's logbook to get the details of this risky mission.
Hanford site in Washington State is where Wally Hendrickson spends his retirement.
Good morning. Can we come in?
Yeah.
Years ago, he was a nuclear fuel specialist at the Idaho National Laboratory. When he was 39, officials sent him and fellow scientist John Horan on a mission to recover the nuclear fuel.
I appreciated the importance of getting the fuel out, and I was quite willing to do that, take the personal risk for the government.
The secret operation took place in the city of Đà Lạt, about 200 kilometers northeast of Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City. American officials installed a U.S.-made research reactor in Đà Lạt called Triga Mark II. Scientists began building Triga in the 1960s. It was a symbol of U.S. support for South Vietnam during the Cold War. The reactor's uranium fuel rods were from America. They had been made with the most advanced techniques, using technology that even the Soviet Union didn't have. Years later, in March 1975, North Vietnamese troops were suddenly advancing into the south and rapidly closing in on the Đà Lạt facility. On March 24th, then Secretary of State Henry Kissinger sent a secret telegram to the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. He feared that Đà Lạt nuclear technology would fall into the hands of the North Vietnamese. Kissinger wanted the fuel to be extracted to keep it from jeopardizing U.S. and international interests. Hendrickson arrived at the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, where he received surprising orders.
We were told distinctly that if we could not remove the fuel and get it out of the country, we were to make it inaccessible and to pour concrete down. And if that weren't available, we were to dynamite the core. But the human consequences were just totally unacceptable to me. And Horan said, "You don't want to do that, do you, Wally?"
If all else failed, they were to blow up the nuclear reactor. The Defense Department was involved in the operation, and its officials studied the plan.
Early in the discussion, the thought of blowing up the reactor in place was brought up, and I actually did some calculations on how much TNT it would take and so on.
The details of the mission were recorded in a logbook by John Horan. The book says that Hendrickson and Horan landed at Cam Ly Airport near Đà Lạt. The scene was chaos.
On March 30th, 10:45 a.m., after landing, the co-pilot refused to enter the taxiing runway where many refugees were waiting.
Crowds of refugees flooded the airport. They were fleeing the approaching North Vietnamese forces and looking for support from the U.S.
The Pentagon would not authorize carrying refugees on the return flight to Saigon after our equipment was unloaded. Ambassador Graham Martin said, "No refugees out, no mission. Blow up the reactor."
Ambassador Martin insisted on transporting the refugees and urged Pentagon officials to allow it.
Flash message sent to the Pentagon. In 90 minutes, the approval was received.
We recommended against it because the spread of radioactivity wouldn't have been a good idea. I thought it would be a big propaganda tool for the communists. So that idea, as far as I knew, was dropped as not being reasonable.
At last, Hendrickson and his team arrived at the reactor and began recovering the fuel. They had to finish before the transport plane returned at 1 p.m. the next day. The work was dangerous. They had to build a protective wall to keep safe from radiation. To limit exposure, they worked in a rotation of 4-person shifts. While the team hoisted the fuel rods, others would hide behind a protective wall, shielding themselves from radiation. This picture shows the team removing the fuel rods. Instead of a crane, workers used their hands to save time. From the top of the reactor, they lowered a hook into the core, using it to lift up fuel rods one by one.
When it got close to the surface, I would bring it up to the level, above the level of the platform, grab the assembly with a gloved hand, and disconnect the fuel handling tool and let it down. I only used one hand. Only one hand got exposure, radiation exposure.
In the morning that same day, North Vietnamese forces reached a base just 12 kilometers from Đà Lạt.
We North Vietnamese soldiers had orders from the Defense Department to liberate Đà Lạt and secure the nuclear reactor. We heard a lot about the reactor, that it was prized because it was made in the United States.
Hendrickson's team continued to work late into the night. It's unknown how much radiation exposure they received. Finally, at 2 a.m. on March 31st, the team finished the job. That same day, a transport plane loaded with the recovered fuel left for the United States as scheduled. 2 days later, North Vietnamese took Đà Lạt. The U.S. scientists had completed the mission just in time. This is a photograph of the reactor's empty core taken by North Vietnamese soldiers. U.S. scientists removed its 67 fuel rods by hand. Their last-minute efforts prevented a worst-case scenario, dynamiting the nuclear reactor.
You know, I'm not used to a military situation. And the town was a tourist town. A university was there. It was a great agricultural area. And you don't do that sort of thing under normal conditions. You don't think of that. I can't justify that. I think would have been a war crime.
Officials later rebuilt the reactor at Đà Lạt using technology and nuclear fuel from the Soviet Union. 40 years after the war, the facility still stands. It remains the only functioning research reactor in Vietnam.
We have with us Professor Yuka Tsuchiya of Ehime University. She's an expert on U.S. diplomacy during the Cold War. Professor, welcome. So this information that there was an option to blow up the reactor is quite shocking. Is this well known?
No, absolutely no. No American or any other people in the world didn't even know there was a nuclear reactor in South Vietnam. So it would have been a huge environmental and human disaster if they blew up the reactor. So we are lucky they didn't.
So from a historical standpoint, how do you view the scientists' mission to recover the nuclear fuel?
Well, the U.S. was really afraid that the living, usable reactor would fall into the hands of the enemy, which is a huge disgrace to the U.S. government. So the mission of the two scientists, it was a heroic deed for sure, but it also symbolized how much casualties the superpowers inflicted upon their own people, not just enemies, because if they arrived a few days later, their lives must have been lost.
Well, then let me ask this question. Well, Vietnam was one of the center stages of the Cold War confrontation at that time. But why did the US government decide to put a research reactor and also nuclear fuels to South Vietnam that time?
Okay, so President Eisenhower at that time was promoting Atoms for Peace campaign. It involved dissemination, information dissemination on the U.S. activities on the peaceful use of atomic energy, but it also included export of nuclear reactors overseas. So first of all, U.S. government was compelled to counter the Soviet peace offensive by showing that U.S. motivation was benevolent and peaceful. And also, there was a harsh competition, technological competition between Eastern and Western Bloc. So U.S. was anxious to outdo the Soviet Union in the field of nuclear technologies. So building nuclear reactors overseas was like building technological colonies overseas. So those countries will rely on U.S. technologies for many years to come. So there was also a business interest involved in there too.
Well, so we can say that it was a very well calculated strategy that fits the American interest. But but they were calling it. What was the name of the initiative?
It was a peaceful use of atomic energy, or Atoms for Peace.
Okay, but it was fitting the Cold War strategy of the United States. And then at the same time, while the government was pursuing this program, they were spreading nuclear arsenals and they were developing it. So how do you explain this too?
Okay, so people in those days all over the world were embracing the rosy dreams about atomic energy. So also American campaign fueled that kind of groundless rosy dreams. But these rosy dreams made it invisible that the same technology was applied to nuclear weapons, and people diverted people's attention from thermonuclear tests that was going on in the Pacific Ocean. And also they created the myth that the civilian use of atomic energy was somehow peaceful and therefore safe.
Professor Tsuchiya, thank you very much.
Thank you.